Well, to unpack all of this, let's bring in our panel. From Nicaragua's capital, Managua, I'm joined by Ben Norton, the founder and editor of the independent news outlet Multipolarista. Ben, let me begin with you. What is Daniel Ortega seeking to achieve with his latest actions?
Well, the reality is that these are not really actions that the Nicaraguan government took. This is a response to aggressive actions taken in general by the European Union and the United States. We can't understand Nicaraguan politics today without understanding that there was a very violent coup attempt in 2018 that was kind of a trial run for the successful coup in Bolivia in 2019. Of course, Latin America is a region that has been colonized by Western powers for hundreds of years. That meddling never ended. The US and the European Union have continued funding extremist right-wing opposition groups that have often resorted to violence to try to violently overthrow the Sandinista government. Of course, when the Sandinistas were first in power in the 1980s, we know that the CIA supported the Contras and imposed sanctions, and those policies continue in a very similar way today. In response to the failure of the coup in 2018, in which hundreds of people were killed on both sides, the US and the European Union imposed illegal unilateral sanctions on Nicaragua, and they've continued to impose more and more sanctions without any international support from the United Nations Security Council, which is illegal. And the government has responded by saying that these are unilateral forms of aggression. Foreign countries are meddling in our internal politics. This is a violation of our sovereignty, and we're not going to have diplomatic relations with them anymore.
So clearly, from a human rights perspective, there is a problem in Nicaragua. For example, according to two experts appointed by the UN and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Nicaragua must comply with its international obligation to respect and guarantee fundamental freedoms. What do you make of that, Ben?
No, I mean, first of all, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is an arm of the Organization of American States, and this gets exactly to the problem I was talking about earlier. These institutions are thoroughly dominated by Western powers and have acted as interventionist tools. The Organization of American States openly in public backed a coup that overthrew the elected government in Bolivia in 2019. These institutions have showed how extremely corrupt and illegitimate they are across Latin America. That's why we see even more centrist presidents in the region, like Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, who are openly criticizing the Organization of American States. There is a crisis of institutional legitimacy because of the bias of these organizations. That's why we've seen the emergence of new
Ben, I just want to make sure I get this right. So you're indicating that there is no problem whatsoever when it comes to freedom of speech and fundamental rights in Nicaragua right now?
I'm saying that these issues are extremely exaggerated by Western powers that have a political interest, a vested interest in destabilizing the Sandinista government. It's no secret that the United States and the European Union strongly supported the neoliberal right-wing governments in Nicaragua that governed from 1990 until 2007 as poverty skyrocketed, unemployment skyrocketed, violence and migration skyrocketed. The Sandinista government that came back in 2007 through democratic elections has been the safest, most peaceful government that Nicaragua has seen in decades. The situation in Nicaragua has actually been much better than in neighboring countries like El Salvador and Honduras, where the U.S. backed another coup in 2009, and Honduras had the highest murder rate on earth. Meanwhile, Nicaragua, there are problems as there are in any country, but Nicaragua is an oasis of stability, and there's much less violence compared to other countries in Central America. We always have to compare apples to apples and not oranges.
I mean, when you say that there are problems, is the president taking effective measures to contain these problems or not?
All we have to do is look at polls. MAR Consultores, which is the main polling firm for Central America, finds that Ortega has around a 70% approval rating. The only other president that's more popular in the region is the new president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, who's also demonized by Western governments and called authoritarian. So the people of these countries are actually quite supportive of their presidents, but then Western powers that have a history of colonizing these countries say that the people are too stupid to understand what their governments are doing and that they're all just brainwashed by these supposed authoritarian leaders. There's a very colonial kind of racist condescension that people use to talk about people in Nicaragua and Central America, which are some of the poorest regions of the world. And the Nicaraguan government has provided healthcare and education and public housing programs in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. I'm from the United States. The U.S. government doesn't have healthcare. The U.S. government doesn't have free healthcare. But in Nicaragua, people actually do have that. So it's not a surprise why the government is popular here.
Okay, Ben, now I know you're going to disagree, but most of the things that Manuel just mentioned have been corroborated by human rights organizations that include the United Nations.
No, I mean, you keep saying the United Nations. You have to point to specific reports from the United Nations. You can't just generally say human rights organizations and then the United Nations. You have to be specific. The reality is that many of these so-called civil society organizations that constantly demonize Nicaragua are funded by Western governments. It's well known the United States has arms of the CIA that have a long history of supporting the Contras going back to the 1980s, like the National Endowment for Democracy, the U.S. Agency for International Development. The European Union has the European Endowment for Democracy. These institutions have funded right-wing so-called civil society organizations that are actually anti-Sandinista activist groups. And this is the same as for media outlets. There are media outlets that actually, during the coup attempt in 2018, were broadcasting open calls for violence, telling people to go out to the streets and to literally hang President Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo in El Carmen. This was in the case of 100% Noticias, which is a U.S. government-funded so-called media outlet. These are open, explicit calls for violence to violently overthrow the government and kill the president. And yeah, that media outlet was shut down because that's not journalism. You can't. The U.S. and the European Union have funded what is essentially terrorism and violence. And they expect that the government just simply allows us. No sovereign government anywhere in the world would tolerate this. Look what happened in the United States on January 6th.
Let me add one more question.
A bunch of far-right extremists stormed the Capitol. That's exactly what Nicaragua has been dealing with for years now.
So as I understand from what you just said, everything that is wrong in Nicaragua right now is due to the West, correct?
No, but it's under attack. We've seen again and again that there are countries like Cuba, which has been under an illegal blockade for 60 years.
Okay, but Cuba is not the topic right now. I also want to focus on the rhetoric that has been adopted by Ortega. For example, he attacked the Vatican, the Chilean president, Gabriel Boric, and Brian Nichols, the White House Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, who Ortega described as a, quote, poor black man with a bulldog face. I mean, that's not the kind of rhetoric we hear from a head of a state, do we?
That's another, politically motivated mistranslation. No, the reality is that why did Nicaragua criticize these foreign leaders who continue to meddle in his internal affairs? Any sovereign leader of any country would criticize a foreign country that is trying to destabilize his government, overthrow his government. All we have to do is look at the recent history of Latin America, where the United States and the European Union have constantly supported coups, military interventions, imposed unilateral sanctions. I mean, we see it so blatantly in the open with the attempt to impose an unelected parallel regime of Juan Guaido in Venezuela, the 2019 coup in Bolivia, the 2009 coup in Honduras, the imprisonment of Lula da Silva in Brazil. The United Nations said that those were illegal. That was a politically motivated case. I mean, across the region, we see this constant attack on any progressive force.
Okay, you have made your point, Ben. Let me move to Peter now. Now, Peter, you have been patiently listening. Okay, Ben. If things continue to move the way they are right now, if Nicaragua continues to sever diplomatic ties with major countries across the world, are you not concerned that Nicaragua could become an isolated country like North Korea?
No, this is ridiculous hyperbole. The narrative that Nicaragua is isolated ignores the vast majority of the global population. The U.S. and Canada and the European Union do not represent the so-called international community, although the West frequently uses that term to refer to themselves. The reality is that Nicaragua has a lot of allies in Asia, in Africa, and other parts of Latin America. For instance, at his inauguration this January, President Ortega had representatives from China, the most populous country on earth, India, the second most populous country on earth, as well as Russia, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Turkey, many countries in Latin America. We're talking about the vast majority of the global population in the global South. So yes, Nicaragua has very negative relations or no formal relations with the West, with the global North, the countries that have colonized Latin America. But the reality is the world is changing. Nicaragua is on the verge of signing a free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, and it's increasing its trade with other countries in the global South. This is part of an overall trend around the world away from Western hegemony. So
Okay.
Nicaragua is not unique in that sense. And saying it's diplomatically isolated ignores the majority of the global population. It's not isolated. It's simply the West that has chosen a very aggressive path. And a lot of countries in the global South are refusing to continue with this kind of these neo-colonial policies.